Ah, you've made it back again. It's been a while. I've heard you've been here, but at times I was out. I had quite the journey since we last met, and I've learned much. Perhaps that can be a story for another night. Still, I am glad to see you again, and with good luck too. A few visitors have brought more mention than normal of odd sights and trails that don't follow the path on the map. This can only mean one thing. The fairies have begun to play. They're a real challenge to handle, so I figure I ought to let you in on a few tips I learned in this old book from long ago. It's a bit outdated in information and ideology, but it's sure enough to keep you safe on your adventures. So, keep your mind sharp and have a seat here at the Campfire of the Lost. Among those creatures one is bound to find while out on an adventure, there are those that are most dangerous and intriguing. Not of fur or claws, but one of wit and tricks, the Fae. These curious creatures are not native to our realm, but manage to leak out through the cracks in reality formed by wild magics. The most notorious of all fairies are those of the forest variety. These Fae are a type of Earthen Fairy, with others that will be described later as being of the air and water variety. Why there are no discovered fire fairies is currently under heavy debate, but one leading hypothesis is that they either became or intermingled with the devils due to their similar understandings and goals. Personally, I am of the belief that it is because their environments are too hostile for us to explore and therefore document, but that is another matter. The Earthen Fairies are the fairies we know the most about, but this is mostly due to their lifestyle than due to any trickery. They live in rock, dirt, and sand, allowing them to exist in almost any terrestrial environment. In their caves, hovels, and cliff sides, they live slow lives, often sleeping for years at a time, thanks to the permanence of their bodies. This ubiquity means they are easy to find, and their long spells of sleep mean that they can be observed easily. While interesting in their own ways, they are not of much mention, and this information is only being presented for later. However, we can see a similar lifestyle at a much faster pace by looking at their closest cousins. The Forest Fairies, as well as being the most widely known, have an odd distinction of being both the least numerous and the most diverse. They inhabit collections of wood of all kind, becoming similar in appearance to the foliage of the tree they inhabit. For example, pine fairies are a dark green, palm fairies are a much brighter green, and fairies of the deciduous variety change from green to their fall colors to brown in winter. These differences in appearance also translate somewhat to behavior. For example, areas of less timber diversity, such as the high boreal forests of the far north, result in large-scale cooperation of fairy species that create great kingdoms centered around hidden cities and castles occupying the most remote area of their territory. This cooperation allows for the use of magic on grand scales, used to survive the hostile environments, while simultaneously becoming greatly prosperous. On the other hand, in places of immense diversity, like in the rainforests of Africa, Southeastern Asia, and the Americas, there is much more conflict and general discord as different individuals, and sometimes tribes, fight for dominance in the crowded environment. There have even been documented cases of large tree falls setting off small-scale wars as fairies rush to fill the new free space. However, these are the two ends of the extremes and fall outside of the most common forest fairy interactions. The fairies of the deciduous biomes are the least numerous, but are interacted with the most due to the general human tendency to occupy the nearby areas, or even turn city areas into deciduous microbiomes. The forest fairies of the deciduous woods operate in a mode between the boreal and rainforest styles, resulting in a cooperative system of tribes and towns. This is theorized to not actually be due to forest diversity, but the proximity of humans forcing them into a more unified front against our activities. These collectives allow for the use of stronger magics to better hide from and repel humans from their homes. Despite all these differences, most forest fairies use the same tactics for evasion and defense if discovered. Their chief strategy is to simply elude their hunter, either by camouflage or, more interestingly, imitation. Many forest fairies that live near meadows will illuminate themselves in a soft, pulsing glow to disguise themselves as fireflies, so as to not draw attention. However, if all else fails, they are prepared to defend themselves not physically, but with tricks and magic. Spells of disorientation and illusion are their go-to solutions for dealing with an immediate threat. Dancing lights and swirling colors distract and confuse, while ghostly sounds and illusions frighten or draw the threat away. These abilities serve them well enough in dealing with threats, but it also allows them to revel in their favorite pastime, mischief. All the Fae indulge in causing trouble, but the Forest Fairies are the most renowned. Their aforementioned proximity to humans, as well as our intrusion and destruction of their territory, provide them ample reason to trick and harass those that come along by subjecting them to dangerous, and sometimes deadly, traps. Areas where there are particularly high numbers of Forest Fairies often create places of legend and mystery. Haunted forest and shadowed glens that frequently create reports of creatures unknown can usually be chalked up to the presence of a fairy city or landmark. The best way to avoid these dangers is to not travel deeply into heavily wooded areas, and if you must travel there, stick to the path, no matter what intriguing or frightening sights and sounds you may find. While of course the Forest Fairies are the most encountered, they are not the only ones that warrant attention. The next noteworthy variety are the Air Fairies. These flighty sprites dash about through the air with reckless abandon. As they dart about, they take great joy in just barely skirting past any object in their path, rustling branches, kicking up leaves, and ruffling clothes. Minor mischief such as this leads to tricks like unseen noises in the forest, shiftings in the grass, and chills in the air. Their classic individual forms are perfect for this. Thin, ghostly bodies slice through the air, and their lower half dissolves into mist to propel them about. However, these interactions happen unusual as they individually go about their business. Things get interesting when they start to form spontaneous packs, tailing off of each other's currents. More and more build off another's playful maneuvers until their numbers swell to over 24 or so, and the group successfully makes a sizable current and are forced upwards. This non-lateral heading runs them into even more air fairies that use the movement to tag along, gaining height with them. The increasing size attracts more and more air fairies from farther and farther away until they reach a critical mass. It is then, when they fill the sky, that they dance. Not like in the orderly style of a traditional fairy ball, or like our gatherings, but in the exact opposite manner. They prance about at incredible speeds, swapping dance partners every instant, no two fairies dancing to the same tune. This fraught frenzy balloons and excites already present clouds, igniting a storm. Clashing winds throw around the moisture that beads together into all that falls from the clouds onto the earth below. As the storm progresses, the fairies' wispy bodies change to match the storm, getting covered in drops of water vapor, or becoming frozen in dazzling dresses of ice. But, as always, the party must end. The fairies use all the energy that drove them to such heights and slowly disperse, drifting back to lower altitudes. There, they eventually regain their strength and go back to their accelerated lifestyle, blasting narrowly past a slow-moving world. The third and most mysterious of the major fairy families are the Water Fairies. Though the least researched, they are easily split into two obvious groups, saltwater and freshwater. The freshwater variety are much more well documented, again due to their general proximity to humans. These categories can again be separated into two more groups, flowing-bodied and still-bodied fairies. The still-bodied fairies are very similar to the saltwater fairies, so we'll talk about them later. The flowing-bodied fairies are found in streams and rivers, cutting through the currents and cavorting in the rapids. Their bodies change from place to place in order to fit the flow they inhabit. Those found in the meandering curves of floodplain rivers are larger, their forms indistinct in the swirling silt, and are less prone to moving, choosing to hold meetings in the eddies of horseshoe turns. Those in swift waters are more streamlined and powerful to avoid being swept away. In order to attend court, many will travel through immensely difficult stretches of water to reach still pools at the bottom of deep cuts in the riverbed. But they have relatives that live in even harsher conditions than they. The Waterfall Fairies live in the plunge holes carved by the relentless downpour, housing themselves in any number of nooks and crannies that line the walls. This exposure turns them into powerful and hardy creatures tempered by the roaring torrent that falls around them. They are considered fully mature when they are able to scale the waterfall they depend on, racing upwards with impossibly quick steps to leap off the falling water and droplets of mist that hang about. The more cunning ones will time their tests to the season of salmon or eel runs, letting the fish do most of the work in propelling them up the falls. Either way, this means they have enough strength or wit to tame, trick, or fend off any manner of creature that might try to occupy their home. This strength is all the more evident when compared to their still and saltwater cousins. These groups are considered very similar, even though more distantly related than both freshwater types are to each other. This overall group of still and saltwater fairies are again split into two different distinctions, photic and aphotic. The photic group occupies the upper levels of their aquatic environments, living in waters with plentiful sunlight that increase productivity of all creatures living there. This is most notable in the so-called rainforest of the sea, the coral reef. The coral fairies are perhaps the most beautiful and diversely shaped of all the fairies. The coral fairies live amongst a correlating type of coral, matching the vibrant colors the coral polyps produce. They even become similar in shape and texture, some with long fans for wings or limbs with bumps and spines. These similarities likely serve a twofold purpose. The similarity in appearance lets them blend into their respective matching coral, while the shape and texture could provide an increase in defense, working as a deterrent for would-be predators. As for behavior, the early comparison continues when looking back to the rainforest fairies. Unlike the rainforest, there is less of a competition for claiming new territory as there is for simply defending their home coral. This is a result of the speed at which the corals develop and die. When a tree falls in the forest, it is quickly replaced, while a space for coral is slowly reoccupied. This need for defense has led the coral fairies to forming partnerships with the many abundant species that live amongst them. A notorious example is the sea anemone and the clownfish. The anemone's fairy allies with a respectable clownfish as a means for each to defend and clean the other. This is a passive partnership, but for an active example, a favorite partner of the coral fairies are the crustaceans. With heavy arms and armor that can injure the hardiest coral fairies as well as other crustaceans, they serve as a perfect mount for reef combat, tamed by the promise of the leftovers from battle. But, while these battle-hardened fae wage war in the sun, even they are fearful of their relatives found over the edge of the abyss. The fairies of the aphotic zones are like the other sea creatures that live alongside them, alien, unknown, and incredibly dangerous. They are ghostly, often almost translucent, as the lack of constant light renders pigments useless. They take the tricks of the forest fairies and make them look like child's play. They employ lure lights that glow like beacons in the dark, as well as ghost sounds that travel for miles through the jet-black waters. These enchanting calls bait creatures of all kinds down deeper and deeper into the abyss, ignoring the crushing pressure and freezing temperatures until it becomes too much. The abyss fairies, able to withstand these extremes thanks to their soft bodies and special blood, take their crumpled prey off into the dark to feast in peace. This is far from the worst of the fairies that live in the deep, for just as the most remote forests are home to powerful archfae, so too do the deepest trenches serve as homes for fae of terrible power and unspeakable appearance that are rumored to have some control over even whole ocean currents. Any expedition into the lowest cracks of the oceanic underworld is incredibly dangerous and must be very carefully prepared for, if it goes through at all. However, these are the fairies that are known, discovered, and, to an extent, understood. This does not mean that these three are all there is to think about, for some simple thought experiments bring more questions than the answers we currently have. I shall present those questions and my theories here without going into extensive detail until later in the book. For example, let's start with the question, where are the fire fairies? As stated, my personal hypothesis goes against the current consensus, but I believe they live in extremely hazardous environments, like lakes of lava, or even farther down in the magma chambers and plumes that feed them, perhaps even into the mantle itself. They could also exist temporarily, as, in general, events involving fire are transient and fleeting, and could afterwards turn into a related species, joining the airborne fairies as one of smoke, or the earthen fae as one of ash and charcoal. This line of thinking then leads us into another question. What about hybrid species? Is the aforementioned smoke fairy now wholly one of air, or is it only until it sheds its particulates that it can be called an air fae? Carried further, the water fae provide innumerable examples of possible hybrids, or even distinct varieties, due to water's inherent chemical and physical properties, primarily its ability to exist in 3 physical states on Earth, as well as being able to mix easily with many natural substances. For example, going the hybrid direction, where would we place a fairy who lives in the mud? They are mostly made of dirt and clay, but their life would likely revolve around staying wet and moist. So are they an earth or water fae? What of a fairy made of steam, clouds, or mist? They no doubt inhabit the air, but they are made of gaseous water vapor, so are they both water and air fae? Then there is the consideration of water's solid forms. Over the years, there have been multiple reports and sightings from the polar regions of fairies made of snow, or others made of ice that live in lavish palaces carved into glaciers. These are undoubtedly water fae, but they act more like the earth and sand and rock fae, respectively. So, do we consider them as one, neither, or both? The last question that comes to mind is about us. Due to the volatility of wild magic, even creatures that have been around as long as fairies are subject to change depending on where they wind up. So, what happens to the fairies that find themselves in the midst of one of our giant cities? This is an area of active research, so the ideas presented may immediately be disproven or confirmed, but that is no reason to not theorize. For example, will any fae that find themselves in a city keep their form, or will the intense pace create enough energy for them to morph as they please? Preliminary findings suggest that some earth fae, much like certain cliff-dwelling falcons, easily make the adjustment, treating the towering buildings around them as no different from the rock they normally inhabit. They are not unchanged, however, as it has been noted that their metabolisms have sped up to match the increased rate at which events can occur. Using this, we may speculate on new variants our emerging environment provides. For example, underfoot in cities are tunnels of incredible size, complexity, and purpose. Cave-dwelling fae could establish themselves in subway tunnels, using the air blasts from the trains to bring prey to them. Increased exposure to light could even mean they regain the vision they lost. Abyssal water fairies could migrate into the sewers after adapting to the new reduced pressure and manage to find themselves right at home, using their light and sound lures to easily draw in prey. This could even aid in the search for possible fire fairies, as there are many locations where fire is continually sustained for heat or power, allowing for possible habitation by these unknown fae. All that was mentioned may seem overwhelming to even the most experienced researcher and rugged adventurer, but fear not. The prior knowledge detailed within this book will help keep us safe as we try to find the answers to these unknown questions, and those questions yet to be asked. This introductory chapter is meant to serve as a means of laying down the basic information and presenting my current theories, so some may stop here before it gets too technical. Therefore, if you learn anything from these words, let it be this. Walk quickly, do not linger, and unless you are very prepared, do not leave the path. So, what did you think? It's a bit scary at times, but really most of the fairies I've met are rather understanding. There are more chapters in the book that I particularly liked that detail specific species, but I think that's enough for now. I think I'll take a note from the end of that intro and add that if you learn anything from me when dealing with the fae, be polite and you'll probably be fine. However, that's going to be it for now, as the sun has long since set, the coals grow dim, and a good night's sleep comes for us all. Thank you for listening to my story around the campfire of the lost. Good night, and good luck.